To you and a very warm welcome. My name is Ashok Sajjanhar. I'm former diplomat, ambassador of India to a few countries. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome each and every one of you. But first of all, our guest of the evening, Ambassador Nils Kamsvåg. I also must congratulate him that notwithstanding the fact that Harshit reminded me today morning that today happens to be notwithstanding the fact that today we have the semi-final of the World Cup and cricket, as everyone knows, even our friends from Norway know, cricket is something akin to religion here. And notwithstanding this fact, we have such a large gathering. So, Ambassador, this really speaks about your star attraction value that everyone is here. And they have been brought here to listen to you and to learn what are the possibilities and the potential in terms of cooperation between India and Norway. The brief introductory remarks, I would like to just flag a few major points, a little bit about Norway, and also a little bit about relations between India and Norway, where they are. Of course, the major presentation is going to be made by the ambassador presently. Norway is indeed a remarkable country. If we look at it in terms of its geographical area, it's about 385,000 square kilometers. If you were to look at it in the context of India, India's geographical area is about 3.2 million square kilometers, which means that Norway is just about 11-12% of India's total geographical area. So in terms of Indian states, it would be something like a little bigger, a little larger than Rajasthan. So that is the territorial area. But in terms of the population, it's just a little over 5 million. So if you look at Delhi with a population of a good 20 million plus, we can imagine how sparsely populated Norway would be. But that having been said, it is truly a remarkable country, notwithstanding its comparatively small size and the small population. First, Norway is not a member of the European Union. Of course, it did try to become a member in 1972, in 1994. There were referenda. They were rejected. But notwithstanding the fact that it's not a member of the European Union, it is a member of Schengen. So I guess everyone who travels to Europe, you get a Schengen visa, you can also go to Norway. It is not a member of Eurozone. It doesn't use the euro. It has its own currency, but it's a founding member of NATO. It has a partnership agreement with the European Union, the European Economic Area, that really makes it to follow. If we have, let us say, more than about 22%, Ambassador, you could correct me, more than 22% of the laws and rules and regulations that the European Union has constructed for its own members. It is also a participant in what are called the four freedoms. The freedom of trade in goods, freedom of trade in services, freedom of movement of capital, and freedom of movement of people. I'm sure most of you here would recognize that it is the fourth freedom that was one of the most important reasons for Britain to go out of the European Union. But Norway is a country, and possibly in his presentation, Ambassador could briefly touch upon this as to how it is not a part of EU, yet it is subscribing to all the four freedoms which the European Union has established. The last 3 years have seen, I'll come to that. But what I was saying is that notwithstanding its small size, it is also in the top ranking in most UN indices. Just to give you a few examples, for instance, it is the highest in Human Development Index since 2009. Quite remarkable. Without a break from 2009 till now, it is the highest human development index. Even before that, it was in the same position from 2001 till 2006. Its standard of living is amongst the highest in the world, definitely amongst the top 5, with a per capita GDP of about $75,000. It occupies the first position in several indices. For instance, the World Happiness Report for 2017 puts Norway at number 1 position. It is the first in OECD Better Life Index. It is the first in Index of Public Integrity. It is first in Democracy Index, and so on and so forth and so forth. Quite a remarkable nation for such a small country, area, population, and having so much of achievement. Of course, it is extremely rich in oil and gas. I think it will come as somewhat of a surprise to many of us that about 50% of Norway's exports come from oil and gas and minerals, and of course extremely rich in fisheries also. More than 20% of the GDP of the country is contributed by oil and gas. However, all this notwithstanding, about 98 to 99% of Norway's electricity is generated through hydropower. So which is again extremely remarkable. Whatever oil and gas it has, it exports to other countries, but as far as its own energy needs are concerned, it meets them through renewable energy. It has the largest government pension fund, the global. It is more than $1 trillion US dollars in value. And as I said, it is the largest such fund which invests in different countries in the world. So this is the country that we will be talking about, which we'll be discussing through the rest of the evening. Speaking briefly, very briefly, about relations between India and Norway. Relations are warm, they are friendly, they are cordial. After all, both the countries, both India and Norway, are democracies. We have similar values, rule of law, free media, etc. And also we have, both of us have mixed economies that I'm sure Ambassador Kamsvåg will speak about it. The last few years have, of course, seen a very significant movement in our bilateral ties. And I'm not mentioning this because Ambassador Kamsvåg has been here for the last 4 years or so, but it is definitely true that the last 3-4 years have given a very strong impetus to our bilateral relations. For instance, in July of 2017, the two Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Erna Solberg, they met on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Hamburg, in Germany. And that was the time that Prime Minister Modi first extended the invitation to Prime Minister Solberg to visit India. And that is the time also when there were discussions that were held about investment of the pension fund. I'm sure the pension fund has been investing in India before that also. Possibly you could, Ambassador, speak about this a little in your presentation. Then next, both the Prime Ministers again met at the India-Nordic Summit, the first India-Nordic Summit that took place in Sweden and Stockholm in April last year. And that conversation, that discussion was again useful in taking our relationship forward. In January 2019, Prime Minister Solberg was in India. She was here as the main guest and the main speaker also at the Raisina Dialogue. So the last few years have seen a great deal of advances in our relations. I don't want to speak about that at any great length because I know that Ambassador will be focusing on this, except to mention two elements. One is that when Prime Minister Solberg was here and in the discussions with the Prime Minister Modi and the joint declaration that was issued after the visit, 2 or 3 particular aspects stood out. One was in terms of cooperation that the two countries could undertake in the area of the blue economy. Now, I think there is a lot of discussion about blue economy, what exactly it is. But I think if I were to put it in simple words, it is basically using the resources of the oceans in a sustainable manner for economic development, growth, and prosperity. So there are many elements, whether it is maritime transportation, whether it is minerals, gases, whether it is also tourism, whether it is fisheries, so everything. And I think that was an area because both India and Norway have very large coastlines. India has about 7,500 kilometer long coastline, and Norway also has a huge coastline. And the second was in terms of cooperation that both the countries could undertake as far as the Arctic region is concerned. Norway has been a founding member of the Arctic Council. India has become an observer of the Arctic Council in 2013. I remember it very distinctly because we worked towards it when I used to be India's ambassador in Sweden. And just a year after I left, I was very happy to see that India has become an observer to the Arctic Council. So what are the possibilities? What is the potential that we can work together? Because I'm sure Ambassador Kamsvåg would have noted that when the last meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Putin took place, then President Putin also invited Prime Minister Modi to collaborate, a collaboration between India and Russia as far as exploitation or joint collaboration as far as the Arctic Council is concerned. So with these few words, let me once again extend a very warm welcome to my good friend, Ambassador Nils Kamsvåg, and invite him to take the floor and share your thoughts about the current status of bilateral relations and where do we go from here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sajjanhar. Very nice being here. I thought what I will do now is that I will use 4 or 5 minutes just to put a little background for our relationships, and then I will basically try to talk about where I see the relationship will be going from here. If we start here just to find out where Norway is, and if you look at the small circle north of Norway, which is the Svalbard Island, it's interesting because here we have, that's on the Svalbard Islands, there are 9 different countries which have research stations, and one of them is India. So I will just come back to that. Try to go back. How long does our joint history go back? Well, we can always discuss that about. But if you've been to Oslo, and you see the real, if there is one national treasure from our history, it's actually the Viking ship you find in the Viking Museum. That was buried around 1200 years ago. If there was a king or a queen being buried, they would bury it in ships so they could use them to travel to the next world. When they dug up, among the things they dug up from that ship was a Buddha figure, some swastikas, and some cloth, which was some kind of silk cloth of Asian origin. So we don't know, of course, how it came there, but it certainly says that there was some kind of direct or indirect contact between Norway and the area which is India now some 1200 years ago. Just a small thing there also. Next time we know when we make landing, for 400 years we were in a union with Denmark, and 400 years ago Denmark established a trading station and a fort later on, which is now very beautifully restored by the authorities in Tamil Nadu. This is in Trankebar. But again, it was the sea which brought us here. Norway was among the first countries which recognized India, and so we also have had Prime Minister Neri was visiting early on in Norway. India also, for Norwegians, is special because the first time we had a development assistance project that was in Kerala, started in 1952, and went on for 20 years. And the basic approach to that was to try to help the Indians improve their fishing techniques, but first and foremost also to improve the living standards of the people living there. And it is, by the way, an interesting background, because we were very poor at that time, also relatively after the war, so we didn't have much money to contribute, but we contributed boats. And in addition, one of there was also political reasons in Norway that they wanted to have the left wing of the Labour Party being focused rather on helping other peoples than creating problems in our relationship with NATO in the domestic debates. Well, let's look at how our trade has been fairly stable over the years. And that of course reflects basically also that the Indian trade has been fairly flat, and it's still we are around the 30th most important trading partner to each other. So clearly there is room for much more on that. Another thing is, of course, this statistic just reflected the trade in goods. But what we see now is also the big majority, actually, of those who get specialist visas to work in Norway are Indians. So, and services also constitute a big part of what we, of our cooperation there. It's increasing very rapidly. And we had a new step in the development of the relationship was earlier this year when our Prime Minister was here. She opened our new green embassy, which gives us a very good platform for the time to come in the bilateral relationship. But what we also what she also brought with her was a new strategy for our relationship with India and how we see it developing, and that's what I thought I will spend the more of the time with. But just a couple of words on why is Norway also in many ways important to India. One of the things is the picture we see here. We see how the sea ice around the North Pole has been diminishing all the time. And this has implications not only for Norway, but these are global implications. Because basically what we know from the research also carried out at the research station in Svalbard is that the thawing of the polar ice also influences the thawing of the ice in the Himalayas, and also the monsoons, both the western and the eastern monsoons. So basically, it's a very, very strong illustration of how closely we are connected globally today. And actually, if you really want to see the effects of global change, you should go to Longyearbyen, which is the capital. It's a place with 2,000 inhabitants, but capital of the Svalbard island, where actually over the last 30, 40 years, the temperature has increased 5 times more than the average in the world. So it's increased with 4 degrees. So you really can see the effects. The second thing is also of interest when it comes to this is that the fact that the ice is disappearing is also changing the geostrategic geography, because what we see here is that traditionally, for instance, all trade between Europe and Asia, if that can go north of Norway and north of Russia, you can save 11, 12 days on this trip. And actually on early projections of the so-called of the bridge, the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese, this was dubbed as the Polar Belt and Road Initiative. So we are developing the relationship has been that, of course, India is increasingly becoming a global partner. For a small country like Norway, it's important to see both what kind of where are the areas where we can get most out of the relationship, but also where can we contribute most to India, because clearly bilateral relationships are based on joint interests. I mean, we may make all kind of general statements, they're easy to make, but if there is no kind of concrete thing to back it up, it doesn't really count for much. So what we have tried to look at then is that there are basically 4 areas or 5 areas which we are going to concentrate over relationship. The first is on democracy and rule of law. And why is that? Well, that is particularly now in a changing world where it's a discussion whether liberalism is in retreat, where authoritarian regimes are getting stronger. For us then, as a small democracy in Europe, it really, a country like India being democratic, it really matters. And that's why also, for instance, we cooperate also through, for instance, international democracy promotion. But also it's as important when it comes to the more ideological part of it. The second thing is, well, we say rule of law, but basically a rule-based world order. And why is that important? That is important. We see it very much these days, where the multilateral organization, the whole kind of architecture we built up after the Second World is very much threatened. And those who eventually pay the biggest price for this system not functioning is small countries. It's much easier in this system. It's not easy for India either, but it's easier for a big power to be heard. That's for small powers. That's why it's very important for us when it comes to preserve this world order, a rule-based world order, is to build alliances on this. And I think a good example of why we think India is so vital of it is that we know that in spite of all ideals, in the world is also to a certain extent that might is right. And India is actually the only big country I know of who has had a border dispute with a smaller country, lost in the International Court of Hague, and accepted the outcome when you're on the sea border with Bangladesh. And for us, that's a very, very good example, that India was willing to go to the International Court instead of knowing that, I mean, none of the neighbors could really bother you, and even accepting to lose. So from that point of view, this is the kind of political thing which for us is very important. The second area, as you saw in the little historic background there I made, the ocean has certainly been what has tied us together. But for us, the ocean is extremely important. And if you looked at, it is right that we have our only about 10% of the landmass of India. But when it comes to the ocean areas, we have the same size. We both have around 2 million square kilometers under territorial waters. And because of us having a much smaller population, we also have a country. For those of you who have been to Norway, you know that when you see the country, see how rich we are in mountains and stones and how poor we are in arable areas. It's only 3-4% of the area in Norway being arable. We have not been able to live of that alone. So we have to a very great extent from times immemorial. We know we have been exporting fish at least since 873. So the ocean has been extremely important for us, and that means also that we have become world leaders in many of these things. We are the second biggest exporter of seafood in the world. We have the 5th biggest merchant fleet in the world. We have all of our oil and gas actually comes from the sea. And we are actually the 3rd biggest exporter of gas, and we are a big exporter of oil. But what we have done also similarly with that is that we have developed our own technology, so that means that we are world leaders, for instance, in subsea technology. We are very advanced when it comes to ships technology and designs. For instance, the first LNG-driven ships, majority of them are still Norwegian. The first battery-driven ships, ferry boats, are Norwegian. And it's also, for a high-cost country like Norway, the only way we can survive in competition is actually to be innovative all the time. Produce quality. So we think we are a very good match here. Again, coming back to the experience even from Kerala. This is a new area of concentration for India. It was mentioned already in the budget speech in February, and it was reinforced now from the new government that one of the 10 areas of future focus for economic growth in India would be on the oceans. And actually, what happened when we had the visit of the Prime Minister, the two Prime Ministers signed a memorandum of understanding on an ocean dialogue to promote the blue economy, and the point was that both on the Indian side and the Norwegian side, we were very much focused on this is not a declaration, this is a program for work. So already the next day, I think 8 secretaries, among others on the Indian side, and a big delegation on the Norwegian side, was sitting down to work out a working program in a number of areas connected to the sea for us to progress on it. And actually earlier today, I was in a meeting in Niti Ayog where all the ministries were met also to report on what has been going on in this field, and I'm very happy to see the progress we have seen. Just to illustrate a bit on how we are working, just to take one area where we are working now, how we are working on this. The different things we then try to do. We have, for us, it's been very important, as I said, to follow this up with activities immediately. So already in February, and remember, I mean, for those of you who have worked in bureaucracy and diplomacy, you know that's really fast since we decided in January. Already then, we launched the first joint initiative to combat marine pollution. We had identified already 4 projects we wanted to develop. You can see here just the areas where we are looking into, and this is just a beginning. And the idea here is to tie together Norwegian and Indian expertise in this area to try to develop programs, so which both can develop into developing new technology, but also will be a key to fighting littering in India. Third area which we are focusing on is energy. Again, Norway is a very big energy producer. Norway and India produces about the same amount of hydropower. We are the 6th or 7th biggest producer of hydropower in the world, and that means that actually we are fully, or 98% of our energy comes from hydropower. In addition, we are now very rapidly developing also wind power. We are the biggest exporter of gas in Europe, second after Russia, third biggest in the world, and that is also actually I was just met with the Indian representative earlier today who told me that India already this year has got 3 ships full of gas from those areas north of Norway where we are producing LNG now. So that's an area where India has in its program will change the energy mix so that from gas being around 6% of the energy mix in India today, it will go up to 15%. So you are dependent on countries who can deliver huge amounts, and Norway is one of these countries. So energy is an obvious area where we also have our two biggest energy companies established here, because it's one thing is the resources we have in Norway, but much more is also the technology. For instance, when it comes to offshore wind, which is an area which is now developing very, very rapidly. I mean, differently from solar, we are not very competitive in Norway when it comes to the climate. The sun seems to be a bit sparse often but we have very generous winds. And we take advantage of that. We built out, our companies built out some of the first huge wind farms north of Scotland. Now they are developing also floating wind power. And the interesting thing, and that is one of the keys for our own economic development, is that we cross-fertilize with our technology. So we are using technology from the exploration of oil and gas on the seabed, and we take that over when we are now trying to develop floating wind power. All of these are technologies also which can be adapted here, but more we have our two biggest energy companies investing here also, and what we see is we then try that they can bring their experience from India to, from Norway to India. In addition, I have to say also is that one of the reasons I think why we were talking about, Ambassador Sajjanhar mentioned our big pension fund, which of course all is built up from the surplus of our oil and gas. But one of the reasons why we have been able to build up so much money, that it has been so successful, is that we have at the same time as we have been building up Norwegian capacity in these areas and built up a Norwegian oil company, we have had opened it completely to international competition, because our philosophy is that that's the only way we can learn quickly, and that for us, a small nation like us, to survive, we have to be among the best in the few areas where we need to be good. But that also means that we will be very happy, as we said, to see Indian companies coming and also investing in our shelf and take knowledge from there and coming down. Fourth areas talking about, that's climate and energy, now and environment, and that's obvious. In some ways for us, we are trying to be leaders in many ways when it comes to green energy. I spoke to somebody who asked me here, for instance, on electrical vehicles, and we have the biggest share of electrical vehicles anywhere in the world. Around 50% of new cars being sold now are electrical vehicles. So we are a front runner when it comes to trying out the technology, but even more to build the infrastructure and have policies which can enforce this. And this is, of course, useful. But what is important is that I think the biggest challenge we have today, coming back again to the sea ice going back, is actually climate change. And clearly, whatever we do in Norway, if we succeed and become, as the government now has as a goal, that we will be a zero-emission country in 2050, frankly, that will have very, very little impact on climate change in itself. That's why it's extremely important for us to partner up with, for instance, if India is succeeding, if we are able together to work on policies, help with transferring technologies, help develop policies which also can set the global agenda, that will really make the impact. And that's why it's strategically for us extremely important to work closely with India in those areas here. And we see that there is very strong interest for that, so that's also important. The last area isn't really an area, it's rather a kind of way of cooperating, and that's research in a way. It's when we had our last strategy for India, it was launched in 2009. One of the areas was that we had at the same time, we had a broader research strategy was coming up. And again, India is a big country. You can have ambitions of being good in all kinds of areas. Small countries like Norway has to be very selective where we are operating, because talent is very democratically spread, and if you're only 5.3 million, you are kind of at a disadvantage. So you have to be strategic, so you have to look at the areas where you can contribute, but you also are looking forward. So for instance, we have 8 countries which have been identified, which should be the countries we first and foremost should have research cooperation with. In a number of these countries, it's because they are the world leaders: United States, Japan, Canada. And then there are a couple of countries where we started, which we said in many ways, in many of these areas, we're behind. I was posted in China 20 years ago. We had research cooperation with them. There were lots of kind of problems with getting Norwegian institutions to coming then, because again, for getting fundings, they have to produce at a high level. So we had to take money not out of the research budget, but of foreign assistance budget to encourage them to do this. And we had the same in the beginning with India, again, because since we know that talent is basically spread the way it is, we know that the countries with the biggest numbers and where we see the biggest growth, even if we may be ahead on some areas now, they will quickly overtake us, which means that we should establish the cooperation well before they overtake us. And that's what we have tried to do. And actually with India, it's been extremely successful, I would say, over the last 4 or 5 years. And this is remarkable if you take out the size. We have more than 100 ongoing bilateral research projects jointly financed. So none of these projects are financed together between Norway and India. And what is happening is that we sit down and identify areas where we think we have something to contribute to each other. And we make call for proposals where it has to be one from each side participating. And it's a wide area of where we are cooperating. Just the last year, of what I remember on the top of my head, antimicrobial resistance, 6 projects initiated, a huge interest. We had more than 50 different research projects which come up. Very important area. Smart grids, since we're talking, polar research, bioeconomy. So it's a very wide area where we are cooperating, and we think that is the key, actually, both to develop our own country. For India's development also, one has to be very focused. But first and foremost, of course, it's only to identify those areas where we have these joint interests, where we can succeed. And what we are actually doing now, we are kind of operationalize these points as we have there. And as I said, I was very encouraging coming back from Niti Ayog today and see how much has been done on the Indian side, so forth, and see all the programs we have marching ahead. So basically what we said today, I mean, of course, ambassadors are supposed to be professionally optimistic, but I really feel today that we really are making a big step forward. Not only that, but we are kind of agreed between us where we have the biggest areas to succeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nils, for this excellent presentation. Very informative, very educative, very illuminating. And, just to underline a couple of the points that you made, fascinating. One, of course, you're right, any relationship, for it to be sustainable, has to be a win-win proposition. And I think that is what we are trying to see as far as India and Norway are concerned. I was also quite happy to hear you take note of the decision that came out from the International Court of Justice, from Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague in terms of the dispute on the maritime issue between India and Bangladesh. And we had, of course, hoped that this message would go to some other countries also for whom the decision came a little later in July 2016. But obviously this message did not get taken up by those countries. So, and I think that is what has really caused so much of difficulty and problem in South China Sea, where we see the whole issue of Indo-Pacific and Quad, etc. coming up. The other aspect that you mentioned is in terms of India going in for gas-based, using much more of gas as far as its economy is concerned. And you said that 3 shiploads of LNG are coming from there. Of course, it would be a very, very long distance coming from, from Norway to India. So I don't know whether obviously there is no possibility of any pipeline coming in from there, not now, not in the coming years or decade or so. But that is something that I wanted you, if you can sort of, give a little bit of loud thinking to it. The other thing that you mentioned is in terms of the shorter route, the northern polar route, through the Arctic circle. Now, of course, it reduces the time. You mentioned that if the traditional route is about 34 days, the shorter route is about 19 days, if my memory serves me correctly, which means that about 15, 20 days of time is being will be lessened as far as this is concerned. But how do you think it is going to impact upon the environment? We've been talking about, you mentioned about the environment and the climate change. If there are more ships that are going to be traversing through that, in terms of the climate change, the increase in temperature, the pollution, and of course what we hear also so much about the exploitation of mineral resources, which that area seems to be very rich in. It is, with all these minerals, it is very well endowed with. So how to use the resources there in a more sustainable manner, if that is something. So these are a few of my comments on your presentation, but just 1 or 2 questions, if I may also add to that, which you might wish to focus on. One is, when we are talking about trade, you yourself said it is, in the range of about $1.2 billion. Now, for a country like India, $2.7, $2.8 trillion economy, Norway, a very prosperous economy, 1.2 is a rather modest figure, and it can go up. When the Prime Minister was here, she had, during their discussions, they said it would go up to about 3 times in another, by 2025 or something. I think that is the target, to increase it. Yeah, meaning you could, yeah, I'll just finish here. And in the area of trade, we have been talking about the bilateral FTA with EFTA, the European Free Trade Association. I remember when I used to be in Brussels in 2007, we started negotiating that when the Commerce Minister had come there. And from 2007, today we are in 2019. I know that about 20 negotiating rounds have been held between the 2 sides. And it would, I think, be very useful if EFTA, for those who are not fully informed, it's a combination of 4 countries. Norway is a major partner. It's Norway, Iceland, it is Liechtenstein, and it is Switzerland. So these 4 countries, they are not members of the European Union, but that's another association, EFTA, and with them we have been negotiating. So if that comes through, maybe that can also provide some sort of an impetus to our bilateral ties. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. Let me first say something maybe of a relationship to EU to clarify. I mean, as was mentioned, we have had 2 referendums where the majority of the Norwegians voted no. We are the only one European country where the population not only once but twice has rejected membership. But we are in many ways economic members of the EU. That means that this European economic area means that we have full members of the single market, or the 4 freedoms, with the exception of two areas which Norway wanted to have outside. One was agriculture, the other thing was fisheries. So that means that basically it's not 20-30% of our laws which are actually developed in Brussels. It's 70-80% of the new laws or regulations decided every year will come that. So which means that we can travel when you trade between Norway and any other country in EU, it's like it's internal EU on it. We are actually one of the biggest net contributors to the EU budget, because the disadvantage with this system is that we have to take all the laws, but we basically have to implement them. We cannot have a democratic say in it. We can try to influence on them, but that also means that since it's our most important trading partner, that's very, very important for us. But as a price for having access to this big market, we are paying around on exchange rate now 375 million, no, 400 million US dollars per year to the 16 poorest EU countries. So that's a kind of what we pay for this access. These questions you took up, LNG, yeah, it's a long way from Norway to India, but it's a long way from most of this market. So it's in some ways a fairly straight line coming back. And these fields, the LNG fields, they are much north of the land mass in Norway also. So it would be too expensive even to have a pipeline from that and on shore. And the fact is with sea transport is that it's fairly cheap, so that doesn't influence more. The second thing, when it comes to this northern sea route, and that's been the dream for a couple of 100 years to find it, Danes Bering who found it in the end. We have been Norwegian ship owners and ship associations have been very skeptical to the whole thing, and that is first out of practical reason. If you saw the slide there, I think it said that only 17 ships sailed there in 2017, and that there are several reasons for it. One is that it's the waters are tricky up there. And when they are tricky to sail in, you have all of Siberia and this area, not many people living there, I can tell you. So you have to, the Russians are building up rescue stations there, but that's very expensive. They are also building new icebreakers, and the Chinese have done that also. But from, so you have to calculate with a higher risk going that way. With taking the normal way. So I think the jury is out still whether how much it will be used in the future, but clearly some think that it's a huge potential there. I think when it comes to protecting the nature up in Arctic, India became a member. You told or an observer in the Arctic Council there, and what the Arctic Council has actually been an extremely successful cooperation in some ways, because it's the 8 Arctic countries, meaning those countries which are neighbors to the Arctic, and then you have a number of other big international players coming in who are not, and that's like India, China, South Korea, and Japan, for instance, from Asia. So who are in there because they said that this is kind of international interest you have of it. What we have is that in spite of the fact that the political relationship between some of the countries up in the north is not the best at the time being, it's also an area where we actually have very much stuck to the rule of the international laws. So even though we have, you may have seen it 3-4 years ago, somebody dropping the Russian flag on the North Pole. And there is, I think the Canadians and the Danes and the Russians all think that they own the North Pole. But the point is that we have very strong, strict rules for how we define who owns what area. That's in the law of the sea. And There will be experts studying the claims coming up, and all the parties up to now has been sticking absolutely to those rules. So from that point of view, it is an area where we can see that the respect for international norms, international laws is actually strong so far. It is a big question between, the potential for resources is huge. There are estimates, for instance, that maybe 22% of all the unfound oil and gas resources in the world can be up there. They think that there are huge mineral deposits. So clearly this is a challenge, and it's very important, and that's where the focus on the Arctic Council work has been very much on environmental issues and climate issues. But it's important also to say from being a Norwegian, where we have 10% of our population lives north of the Arctic. We have Russia, have big populations also living there, and so forth. Is that it's important for us that we have to protect the environment, but at the same time we have to protect the lives of these people, which means also that we have to manage these resources in a sustainable way, and that's what we try to do, and that's also where we have very strong help from having all these major powers participating actively in the Arctic Council. Last question on the bilateral trade agreement, India-EFTA. The answer is yes. We would very much have wanted it for a long time. We think that would be a big impetus to our bilateral relations. For instance, our wonderful salmon. India is not one of our 100 most important markets for salmon. And you can understand that if you're told that you pay 35% customs for processed salmon when it comes here. So clearly that will happen, and I think that's one of the areas where actually the new government also will have to really to do a rethink, because you have one thing is the relationship with EFTA and India, which I think is important in itself. But of course there are regional trade agreements now being negotiated and so forth. So we all have to see, kind of find out to what extent we can use them to increase our trade and increase the production in our own countries.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Nils, for these responses. And I agree with you, that this government has tried to give a push to the bilateral trade arrangement between India and EFTA, because if I recall, the negotiations between India and EFTA were sort of blocked in 2013, and then they started again in 2016, and after that we've had a number of negotiating meetings. So hopefully it will go forward. But two more questions, if I may, before I let you go. One is on the issue of terrorism. Now, I know that Norway also suffered its own terrorist attack way back in 2011, when you had, I think, on the same day in two places, both one at a beach resort, and I remember because I was in Sweden at that time, and it made such a huge news at that time that there was a Norwegian person who had gone and who had Andrei Breivik, if my memory again serves me correctly. So and I see that in the declaration when Prime Minister Solberg was here, terrorism does find a very important mention. Your support to the early conclusion of the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism is there. I do also recognize that Norway has always been very supportive in whether it is India's membership of the UN Security Council, India's membership of the Nuclear Suppliers Group, and of course of the other three agreements, Wassenaar Agreement, Australia Agreement, and the MTCR. So on terrorism, if you could share some thoughts as to what your position would be. And the last question that I would like, if you could respond, is is in terms of in terms of, India wants to go in very actively into manufacturing, into innovation, into research. And Norway is one of the world leaders in that. So is there some possibility of cooperation in that area, and whether something is happening, out of the discussions that have taken place when Prime Minister Solberg was here?
First on the question of terrorism, and as you mentioned, actually this terrorists killed 77 people on 2 occasions. 69 of them were young people at a political camp, actually, on an island. So we have, for us, as for India, it's been very important to battle terrorism. We also have had a number of people going from Norway to fight with ISIS in Syria and Iraq. So we recognize clearly the problem. What I can say is that we have established dialogue with India, not only between the ministries of external affairs on these issues, and so I think there we see very much the same way with the importance of underlining international cooperation for battling terrorism. When it comes to manufacturing, we are really not a manufacturing nation in some ways. We are producing in some limited area very advanced technology, being military technology, being technology connected to the sea ship technology, and subsea technology, and these things. And that's actually areas where we are discussing. That's part of this dialogue. We have this ocean dialogue, and actually came up also on the meeting we had in Niti Ayog today, because clearly that's one of the areas we have something to contribute, and it's of course also interesting for us to cooperate with India on this in this area, and there we see a big interest. And I think these are the areas where we have the most to cooperate with. Also other areas where we see where businesses are involved. For instance, one of the interesting things we try to do within this joint research program we have with India is actually that we try to have it as much as possible geared towards applied science, which means that we can take it in and utilize it in developing economies. And last year, when we had a call on smart grids, and smart grids is very important for optimizing the use of energy, and particularly in a situation now where we get more and more renewables into the grids. And the condition for participating, coming up with projects there from us was that there had to be one both on the Norwegian and Indian side in the consortia which came with proposals. There had to be one company and one research institution. Again, because we wanted to try this thing to have the cooperation between businesses and research as close as possible, so that actually what came out of this could be directly adapted into the economy and to help to develop the economy. And that's very much the focus on most of the research projects we have. The optimum research project actually should contribute also to developing the economy.
Well, thank you very much. I think what you say is very right in terms of the significance and the importance of developing the smart grids. Because as India is going increasingly for renewables, we have the solar. You said Norway does not have particular strengths in solar because of the geographical location. But as far as wind energy is concerned, I think that is something where we can definitely cooperate. And as we have seen that over the last few years, and you have been here during that time, that we have increased the share of renewables from 22 gigabytes to 175 gigabytes by 2022. And in that, of course, we have 100 gigabytes from solar energy, 60 gigabytes from wind energy, and 15 gigabytes from other sources like biomass and other things. So I think there, how to get this energy that is being generated into the main grid system, I think that's a huge challenge. And you know, how do you flawlessly, because these energies are available not at a permanent all the time. Solar energy would be only during daytime. How do you store them? How do you get it into the system? So I think these are huge challenges, and I'm sure those are areas where India and Norway would be able to cooperate. So with these words, Nils, let me thank you. Thank you on behalf of all the audience that has been here. As I said, today is a very important day. We have the semi-final of the World Cup going on, but all of them have sacrificed that. They have come here to listen to you, and I think all of us are going very well informed, very well educated. And so on behalf of each and every one of here, I would like to thank you. Thank you for being here. Also, I would like to thank each and every one of those present here for their presence and for being such a wonderful audience.
Thank you very much. It's been an experience for me. I'll just have to correct myself on one thing, you know, on energy, on solar. Actually, we have very big solar companies, but my point was rather that Norway in itself, their solar will never be a big part of it. But when it comes to developing technology again, our big energy companies are focusing much on that. But anyway, it's been a great pleasure and an experience.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.